The town of Briar Flats had been dying for years, only it had learned how to do it quietly. In the mornings, the sun still rose bright as a promise, but by midday the light felt thin, like it had been strained through dust and sickness. The rail line that never fully arrived, the mines that kept shifting deeper into collapse, the saloons that stayed open while churches emptied, and the storekeeper who traded in canned peaches and bottled tonic all sounded the same when you listened long enough. Money leaving, people following. Drew Calder had arrived when there were still enough bodies to bury with dignity. He'd set up his practice in a narrow building that smelled of lard, camphor, and boiled linen. He'd stitched up butchered hands, reset broken wrists, and pulled splinters out of men who came in laughing too hard to hide pain. When a child's fever made its own weather inside a room, he sat by the bed with his sleeves rolled up and his medicine laid out like a careful prayer. Now the town was smaller than Drew remembered, and so were his supplies. He had learned to ration tincture and keep his own fear behind his teeth. There were days when he watched the dust settle on his medicine bottles as if it might be a kind of answer. That was why, on the day Arizel Crow Moon arrived, Drew almost missed her. A wagon had gone by an hour earlier, the driver snapping his reins like the sound could keep away bad luck. After that, the road was only wind and distance. Drew had stepped out with a kettle to boil water for bandages when he saw a shape near the creek, something too still to be only a traveler. At first he thought it was a bundle of cloth left in the ditch by some careless hand. Then it moved. Not quickly, never quickly, but enough to tell him the person inside it was alive. Arizel was not dressed for the road the way mail-order advertisements in Eastern papers insisted women must be. Her clothes were frontier practical, layered and patched. A faded indigo dress at the center, buckskin wrapped around her like a second skin, leggings stiff with dried mud. Her hair was braided and pinned back, but the braid had loosened in places where sweat and travel had worked at it. Her wrists carried old marks, small, telling injuries that looked like the kind of history you couldn't wash out. She sat with her back to a cottonwood root, head tilted as if she was listening to a sound only she could hear. When Drew approached, she did not flinch at the sight of him the way most desperate people did. She looked past him briefly, as though he were not the only door opening in her mind. "Easy," Drew said, because his voice had learned to be gentle when his hands were busy. "You're bleeding, miss. Can you stand?" Arizel's mouth moved, but the words came out in fragments. She was trying to speak with the kind of restraint that came from knowing pain could be a language. When Drew crouched, he saw the reason her body had stayed curled in on itself. Her left side was bruised, and the cloth wrapped there was soaked through in places. Her face held a tension that belonged to someone who had watched violence before and survived it by becoming quiet. Drew wanted to call her a name, but he had no way to know it. He reached for the satchel at his hip, pulled it open, and set out what he could without making it a spectacle. "I can make you warmer," he offered. "We're not far. My house is just—" Arizel's gaze flicked to the creek, then to the road behind him. The way she watched said she expected someone else to arrive, expected pursuit to be constant. Drew stood carefully, not crowding her. "You ran from something," he said. It wasn't a question. Arizel finally lifted her chin. Her eyes held a hard, distant brightness. "They followed," she said, and even that single sentence sounded like it had been carried a long way. "I kept moving." "Then you're moving toward trouble if you stay out here," Drew replied. He had treated men with broken ribs who still tried to tell jokes to prove they weren't hurt. Arizel didn't joke. She just breathed, shallow and fast, as though each breath might run out. He offered a hand, and for a moment she seemed to consider him, to weigh his usefulness against the risk of trust. When she let him help her up, it was not surrender, it was decision. He guided her to his building. The first room smelled of boiled linen and old tobacco from the last patient who'd insisted on talking with his mouth full. Drew had curtains to keep the cold drafts from biting. He had a narrow bed, clean sheets he treated as sacred, and a wash basin that reflected the lamplight in a small, wavering circle. Arizel lay down without asking permission, then winced when the motion tugged her bruises. Drew examined her carefully. He cleaned the wound with water and a solution that stung, then pressed cloth in place so it could stay steady. He felt her flinch at the pain, but she did not scream. "You're the doctor," she said. It wasn't gratitude yet, it was assessment. "I'm the one who stays when the town runs out of men to do it," Drew answered. Her gaze slid across the room, taking in the faded posters for tonics, the stack of medical journals with pages warped from damp, the cracked picture of a saint he kept more for comfort than belief. "There aren't many who stay," she murmured. Drew could have asked how she'd come to Briar Flats, why she'd been alone on a road that didn't forgive mistakes. But questions felt like needles, and Arazel already had too many. Instead, he asked, "Can you eat? Soup will settle your stomach." Arazel's eyes narrowed. "Soup isn't for people like me." Drew understood the grammar of fear. People like her, Apache women, native women traveling with less protection than a white man's wallet, were often treated as a problem to solve rather than a person to save. In Briar Flats, the rules were strict about what a town would allow itself to see. He did not argue. He poured broth anyway. When she hesitated, he held the spoon closer. "If you refuse, I won't force you," he said. "But if you want to keep living, you'll take it." Her lips parted. She swallowed carefully as if each bite cost her something. When the wound began to calm, Drew cleaned up the mess and made a thicker poultice. He told her to rest, and he watched the way her shoulders rose and fell like someone standing in a storm. She won't leave until she can, Drew thought, but he didn't say it. He had another worry. Briar Flats was small enough that trouble traveled fast. The moment people heard that a wounded native woman had been brought into Drew's practice, the question wouldn't be whether she was hurt. The question would be whether she was worth the risk. Before night fully settled, Etta Wren arrived. Etta was the only woman in town besides the storekeeper's wife who didn't hide behind curtains when a man called out a name. She ran the boarding room, what remained of it after 2 women had fled and the proprietor died of fever. She carried her own grief like a tool, useful but heavy. She knocked before entering because Drew had taught her that politeness mattered even when the world didn't reward it. When she came in, her eyes took in Arazel's posture, the bandage, the way Arazel kept her face guarded. Etta didn't offer surprise. "You found her," Etta said. Drew nodded. "She's hurt. She needs time." Etta folded her arms. "Time costs. The marshal asks questions. The men at the saloon ask questions. Folks ask questions even when they don't want answers." Drew's mouth tightened. "I can't turn her out." "You can," Etta replied. "You could be the one who calls the law, the one who keeps his hands clean. That's how men live longer here." Drew looked away. He didn't like how easily Etta could speak the truth. He had seen men wash their hands of suffering in the same way they washed their boots. Quick, thorough, and only until someone else's problem appeared. Arazel sat up slightly, as if she'd understood the tone even if she hadn't caught every word. "The law comes when there's a body," she said. Her voice was lower now, steadying as her breath found a slower rhythm. "It comes when there's something they can take." Etta's face changed, a brief tightening around the eyes. "They'll say you're trespassing," she warned. "I'm not property," Arazel replied, and the words carried an old exhaustion. Drew could hear that she'd had to fight for that truth before. Etta let her gaze rest on Arazel a moment longer. "No," she said finally. "They'll say you are." Drew stood between them not because he needed to, but because he could. He felt the weariness of his own life press on his bones. His practice was a small island in a larger sea of hunger. "I'll speak to the marshal," he decided. Etta's laugh was thin. "And say what? That you're sheltering an Apache woman in your sick room? That you think it's decent?" Drew met her eyes. "It is decent." "Decent doesn't stop hunger," Etta replied. "Decent doesn't stop men who feel entitled." That was when Drew's mind, trained on triage, began to calculate. He didn't want to marry anyone. In a dying town, marriage could be a joke. It could also be a shield. He thought of the legal loopholes that let a man claim authority over a woman's residence, her papers, her safety. He thought of how the law in Briar Flats followed blood and paperwork more than mercy. Drew turned toward Arazel. "Do you have anyone who will claim you?" Arazel's eyes flicked away. "No." Etta's voice softened, but only a little. "That no is trouble," she warned. Arazel's hands curled in the blanket. "They left me," she said quietly. Drew felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. "Who?" Arazel hesitated, then lifted her chin as if forcing herself to speak. "My people moved. Raiders, some men from here, took what they wanted. I ran with what I could." "What did they take?" Drew asked, already knowing the answer would be worse than the question. Arazel reached toward her sash, then stopped as pain shot through her ribs. She drew her hand back. "They wanted proof," she said. "Proof of who I am. Proof of who they can trade for." Drew could hear the moral complexity behind her words. People could do terrible things for reasons that sounded practical in their own mouths. Traders called it commerce. Soldiers called it duty. Towns called it order. Etta moved closer, lowering her voice. "If the marshal learns you're alone, he'll decide what he thinks you're worth," she said. Arazel's face went still. "Then I need a decision before he decides." Drew understood, and the understanding frightened him. It would mean acting against the grain of what he believed a doctor should do, using law like a medicine. But he'd learned medicine was never clean. Sometimes you had to lie to keep someone alive. "Marry me," Drew said. The words startled even him as they left his mouth. He hadn't planned them. He hadn't rehearsed them. They were simply the desperate logic of protection, dressed in the only costume Briar Flats respected. Etta froze. Arazel stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't know she could understand. "You don't know me," Arazel said. Drew let out a breath. "No," he agreed, "but I know the town, and I know what it will do if you remain unclaimed." Etta's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Drew," she warned, "a marriage of convenience won't stop cruelty. It only tells cruel men where to aim." Drew looked at Etta, then back to Arazel. "It will put her under my protection," he said firmly. "I'll bring the pastor or the clerk. We'll have paper. We'll have a story the marshal can accept." Arazel's gaze drifted over his face. She looked for weakness. She looked for deceit. Then, unexpectedly, she nodded once. "If paper keeps men from my body, I'll wear it," she said. "But you must understand, I am not your purchase." Drew's throat tightened. "I won't treat you like that." Arazel held his eyes. "Then you won't leave me to bleed when it's inconvenient." He couldn't promise a life free of pain. He could promise presence. "I'll stay," he said, and the vow landed heavier than he expected. Etta stepped back, her hands twisting in front of her apron. "The town will talk," she said. "Let it," Drew answered. "I'm already being talked about for keeping a wounded woman." "Not like this," Etta pressed. "Not with a doctor marrying a woman the town thinks shouldn't exist." Arazel watched Etta with sharp attention. "You're afraid," she observed. Etta swallowed. "Yes," she admitted, "because I'm the one who has to keep the boarding room running, and men decide their own rules here. You think they'll respect paper? They won't. They'll respect whatever power they think they can take." Drew felt the danger under her words like a hidden fracture. Arazel's voice grew softer. "Then we'll build a new power," she said. When Drew arranged the marriage paperwork, it wasn't romantic. It was administrative, hurried, and thick with moral grit. The clerk in Briar Flats was so eager for business that he didn't ask many questions. Drew paid in cash he'd set aside for winter medicine, and the clerk pretended not to notice where it came from. The pastor, thin as dried paper, performed the ceremony with eyes fixed on his own shoes. He gave them words about vows, but those words felt like a blanket laid over a wound. Arazel stood through it with her jaw clenched. Drew watched her hands, careful not to touch her too much. He didn't want to take, he wanted to give. Etta helped stitch up the hem of Arazel's dress for the short walk back to Drew's practice. She brought clean water, boiled linens, and a small candle stub. Quiet sacrifices offered without needing thanks. When it was done, the town didn't suddenly become kind. It became louder. Soon Drew heard it. Men in the saloon talking about the doctor's weakness. Women in doorways murmuring about bad blood. The marshal's voice clipped with suspicion. Some people believed the marriage meant Drew had lost his judgment. Others believed it meant Arazel was finally someone worth hunting. The first real threat came not from the marshal, but from the railroad contractor's foreman, a thick man with a temper like a loaded pistol. He arrived in town with 2 hired men, asking about the woman Drew had brought in. Drew intercepted them at the street where dust turned sunlight into knives. "You want something?" Drew asked calmly. The foreman smirked. "I heard the doc's got himself a new wife. Might be worth a look." Drew felt his anger rise, hot and sharp, but he held it back like a pulse. "She's under my roof." "That's a nice phrase," the foreman replied. "Under your roof is one thing. Under your care is another." His men shifted their boots, hungry for permission. Drew's mind moved faster than his body. In medicine, you learn to act before infection spreads. He stepped forward just enough to make it clear he'd noticed them. "You come into my practice and you'll leave with a hand missing," he said. The foreman laughed. "What? You'll heal me afterward?" Arazel appeared behind Drew like a shadow he hadn't noticed until it was too late to pretend it wasn't there. She held herself upright, bruises hidden under clean cloth now, and her eyes were calm in a way that made Drew uneasy. She looked at the foreman without flinching. "You're the one who followed my people for trade," she said. The foreman's smile tightened. "I don't know what you think you know." Arazel's gaze dropped briefly to his belt, to the knife handle, then lifted again. "You took what you could carry. You left what you couldn't." The foreman blinked, then recovered. "You're speaking nonsense." Arazel's voice grew colder. "Not nonsense, memory." Drew felt a chill run through him. Arazel didn't just recognize faces, she carried receipts. The foreman's men started toward Drew and Arazel, but Etta stepped out from the boarding room with a pitcher in her hands, her expression flat and ironed smooth. "Gentlemen," Etta said, loud enough for the street to hear, "he's in his own house. If you want trouble, go find it in the saloon where it belongs." The foreman looked at Etta as if she was an obstacle he hadn't counted. "Mind your business." Etta smiled without warmth. "My business is the rent and keeping my tenants alive. Yours is wherever you can't keep your hands to yourself." Something in Etta's tone made even the men hesitate. It wasn't bravery alone, it was practiced survival. Drew realized then that Etta had been braver than anyone gave her credit for. The town had taught her to speak like a wall. The foreman spat into the dust and backed away, but not without a threat tucked behind his words. "Doctor," he said, "marry all you like. It won't make her a saint." Arazel watched him leave. When he was gone, her shoulders loosened a fraction, then tightened again immediately. Drew turned to her. "Are you safe?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something like grief beneath the guard. "I'm married now," she said. "That changes who can touch me." "But it also makes you a target," Drew replied. Arazel nodded once. "Everything that keeps me alive also paints me in brighter colors." Drew wanted to soothe her. Instead, he offered honesty. "I didn't think ahead as far as I should." Arazel's face softened, not into forgiveness, but into recognition. "You thought of the law as medicine," she said. "That's a clever kind of kindness." Drew felt his chest tighten. He'd been taught his whole life to keep emotions tidy. Now they spilled anyway. They lived together after the marriage in a careful rhythm. Drew's work filled days with small rescues and bitter reminders. Arazel healed slowly, sleeping with her hand resting near her bandage, as if she expected pain to return by nightfall. At first, their intimacy was built of silence. Arazel kept her distance unless she was needed. Drew asked questions only when her face told him she could answer. He cooked when he could, even when the town frowned at the idea of a woman from the wrong people sitting at a doctor's table. Etta stayed nearby. She watched them with the suspicion of someone who wanted to believe and the jealousy of someone who feared hope. Over weeks, Arazel began to help. Not as a servant, but as a partner with skills Drew didn't expect. She knew herbs, what grew near the creek, which plants helped fever and which only pretended. She could read bruises like a book and understand how injuries changed in cold weather. Drew had studied anatomy and studied it hard, but no textbook told him how a certain kind of swelling could mean infection coming like a storm. Arazel taught him the language of the land. In return, Drew taught her medicine in his own way. He let her watch stitches laid out on clean cloth. He let her smell the tinctures so she wouldn't fear them blindly. He showed her how to boil water properly, how to keep a wound covered without suffocating it. They became allies, and slowly, against both their better judgment and the town's loud expectations, something else became real, something neither of them had asked for. On an evening when the wind carried dust into the porch boards, Drew sat outside with a lantern. Arazel sat near him, knees tucked beneath her, mending a strip of cloth that looked too delicate for frontier life. "You're mending things that won't last," Drew said. Arazel didn't look up. "Everything won't last," she replied, "so I make it last as long as it can." Drew watched her fingers move. They were sure, practiced, and careful. He realized how he'd been wrong about her, how he'd assumed her survival had made her hard. She was hard in one way, yes, but in another way she was gentle with the world. "Why did you say you'd wear paper?" he asked softly. "You could have run again." Arazel paused, then answered in a voice that carried the weight of a confession. "Because the first time I ran, I was alone. I learned that alone is a kind of death." Drew swallowed. "And with me?" Arazel's eyes lifted. In the lantern light, her gaze looked almost unbearably dark. "With you, I'm not alone," she said. "But it isn't love yet." The words struck him like a slap and a blessing at the same time. "Then teach me," Drew said before he could think better of it. Arazel's face tightened. "Teach you what?" "How to deserve you," Drew replied. For a moment she looked like she might refuse. Then she let out a slow breath. "Deserve is a word men use to avoid doing better," she said. "Do better instead." Drew smiled faintly, and the smile surprised him. It was the first time in months he'd felt anything light. "I'll try," he promised. Then, just as tenderness tried to settle into their days, trouble returned, loud and official. The marshal came with 2 riders and a thin paper folder tucked under his arm like a threat in a book. Drew knew before the words were spoken that the town had been waiting for this moment. The marshal's mustache looked more groomed than his conscience. "Drew Calder," he said, voice formal. "You've put yourself in a precarious position." Drew kept his stance steady. "She's my wife." The marshal's gaze slid to Arazel. "Your wife is an Apache woman." Arazel flinched at the word Apache as if it were a knife pulled out slowly. Drew noticed it. He also noticed how Arazel's fingers moved subtly, as though measuring distance and exit routes. The marshal continued. "There's a notice. A man in the next territory claims she belongs to him. Papers were filed. He says you married her by fraud." Drew's stomach turned. Arazel's face went pale, then controlled itself. "He claims," she repeated. "That's all." "Fraud," the marshal echoed. Etta stepped out behind Drew, her expression hardening. "You can't just accuse a married woman based on a stranger's claim." The marshal looked at Etta. "Ma'am, this is not your concern." Etta's voice stayed level. "It is. People here are hungry for a reason to hurt someone. Don't give them one." The marshal's jaw tightened, but he didn't dismiss her. He was careful enough to know Etta might make trouble. Drew felt his desperation rise like fever. "Show me the notice," he demanded. The marshal produced the paper and handed it over. Drew read. The document wasn't a deed or a birth record. It was a trade claim, something related to past agreements and compensation for property lost during raids. It was forged in the way only desperate legal language could be. The names were wrong in small ways that would be invisible to someone who didn't know what to look for. Drew's eyes caught on a detail. The signature line was written by a hand he recognized. He'd seen the foreman's handwriting before on ration orders. Drew understood the twist unfolding in real time. Arizel wasn't just a target because she was native. She was a target because she carried something that could be traded. But what she carried wasn't only an identity. It was proof of whose land, whose lineage, whose authority. Arizel leaned closer, reading the paper as if the words were familiar. When she looked up, her eyes weren't pleading. They were furious. "Those men think I'm proof of their story," she said. "But I have my own story." Drew felt the hair on his arms rise. "What story?" he asked. Arizel's gaze drifted past him to the shelves in the corner of the room, the ones where Drew kept his medical journals and his ledger books for patients who couldn't pay. Her voice lowered. "I brought something," she said. "When I ran, I hid it. It's not money. It's not an object. It's a memory made into matter." Etta's eyes widened. "What did you hide?" Arizel looked at Etta, then back at Drew. "A beadwork strip," she said. "It was taken from me when I was a girl. It marks my line. It marks where I'm supposed to go when I'm not allowed to go." Drew's heart thudded. He hadn't seen any beadwork on her besides the sash, but the sash could be older, and some patterns carried deep meaning. The marshal cleared his throat. "Enough talk, we'll take her for inspection." Drew stepped forward, placing his body between the marshal and Arizel. "You'll inspect her by leaving her alone," he said. The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Doctor, you can't defend her with tenderness." Drew's voice went rough. "You'll defend yourselves with it if she dies while in your care." That threat made the marshal hesitate, because Drew was right. In Briar Flats, a woman in custody could disappear into a ditch as easily as a bottle of medicine. Etta moved with sudden decisiveness. She reached into a drawer near the wash basin and pulled out a folded cloth bundle. Arizel's breath caught. Etta unfolded the cloth. Inside was a narrow strip of beadwork, carefully wrapped. It looked older than the sash and more deliberate than decoration. Patterns threaded with a story Drew couldn't fully interpret. "How did you—" Drew began. Etta swallowed and looked away, cheeks darkening. "When you weren't watching," she said, voice low. "She asked me to keep it. She told me if the marshal came, it might be the only thing that proved she wasn't yours by law." Drew turned toward Arizel, shocked by the depth of her trust. Arizel's eyes held his, steady as a carved post. "I trusted you with my life," she said. "I trusted Etta with my lineage." The marshal scoffed. "Beadwork can be anyone's." Arizel's voice sharpened. "Then ask who taught me the pattern," she said. "Ask who sat by our fire and told me what it meant." The marshal didn't have an answer, and that was the truth that mattered. Drew felt the moment snap into something different. The marshal could arrest a wounded woman based on forged papers, but he couldn't easily confront evidence that carried cultural specificity, evidence only certain people would understand. Etta stepped closer, holding the strip out so the light caught the beads. "This isn't decoration," she said. "It's a marker." Arizel watched the marshal's face for the change that would tell her he was recalculating. She wasn't asking for permission to live, she was pushing back. The marshal's jaw worked. "We'll verify," he said finally, voice colder. "Later." Arizel let out a breath that was almost a laugh without joy. "Later is a gift," she murmured. But gifts could come with strings. As the marshal's riders turned to leave, Drew noticed Etta watching Arizel not only with sympathy but with fear. It wasn't fear of the marshal. It was fear of what Arizel's truth might mean for Drew's own life. That night, after the town settled into its uneasy hush, Drew closed his office doors and sat with Arizel by the fire. The fire crackled like it was trying to speak. Arizel's bandage was fresh. Her bruises had faded to a yellowish shadow, and her face looked less like a survivor and more like a woman who was beginning to think about tomorrow. "I lied," Drew said suddenly. Arizel blinked. "About what?" "About it being a marriage of convenience," he admitted. "I told you paper was protection. It is. But I also wanted you to stay. I wanted the town to stop watching you like you were a problem." Arazel stared into the flames. "You wanted to keep me," she said. "Yes," Drew answered plainly. Arazel's lips parted. "Then we're in danger," she replied. Drew frowned. "Danger because you don't want me?" Arazel shook her head slowly. "Danger because love makes people greedy," she said. "Men don't just want a woman, they want to win." Drew swallowed. "Then we'll stand together." Arazel turned toward him, and the tenderness in her eyes caught him off guard. It was not a soft romance. It was a fierce kind of care. "You don't understand the twist yet," she said. Drew's chest tightened. "What twist?" Arazel's voice grew quieter. "When the men took me, they also took a promise," she said. "A promise that belongs to a man who isn't the one pretending to claim me." Drew felt a dread creeping in, a slow sickness behind his ribs. "Who?" Arazel hesitated, then reached behind her dress and drew out a small pouch. She untied it with careful fingers and tipped the contents into her palm. Inside was a letter, folded many times. The paper looked old, edges softened by handling. Drew recognized the seal at once. It wasn't just familiar, it was stamped in a way that made his blood turn cold. The seal was his own family's, not his personal one, his father's. The mark Drew had seen on his father's deeds and legal papers, papers Drew had always believed were safe, always believed were a past closed. Arazel held the letter out. "You were born with a name," she said. "A man with your seal signed a treaty once. He helped take what my people needed to keep. He promised something in exchange." Drew couldn't breathe for a moment. He had lost his father years ago. His memories of him were of kindness and routine, of hands smelling like leather and ink. Yet now Arazel spoke like she was pulling a splinter out of the town's history. Etta, who had been standing quietly near the door, stepped in. "Drew," she said softly. "She told me something like this earlier." Drew's eyes snapped toward Etta. "You knew!" Etta didn't meet his gaze. "I didn't know it would come with your seal," she admitted, "but I knew your past wasn't as clean as you pretended. I didn't think it would reach into your bed." Drew felt sick. Arazel's face didn't twist into accusation. It looked tired, almost resigned, like she had run so far that anger had become a tool rather than a comfort. "I didn't bring the letter to punish you," she said. "I brought it because the town will use my body for their stories, and if they do, they'll do it using your seal too, because it makes their lies look respectable." Drew's mind raced. He had been defending her with law. Now law was tangled in his own family's shadow. "Why marry me?" he asked, voice hoarse. "If you knew about the treaty, why come to my practice at all?" Arazel's eyes held his. "Because you're the only man in this dying town who could make a lie into protection," she said. "And because I can't go back alone. My people won't all come. Some will, some won't. But I need a place to be between now and then." Drew looked at the fire, at his hands. He felt suddenly like a child again, like someone who had grown up believing stories that weren't true. "I owe you," he whispered. Arazel shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Don't pay me with words. Pay me by doing better than your family did. Pay by keeping the town from turning me into a transaction." Drew nodded slowly, the movement heavy. External conflict now felt sharper. If the town used his family seal to justify taking Arazel, Drew's entire defense would collapse. His practice, his reputation, his ability to keep other patients safe, everything depended on his standing. He would lose it to save her, and he would lose her if he failed. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and went back out into the night where the air smelled like sage and smoke. Etta followed with a lantern. Arazel stayed by the fire, watching, her eyes distant. Drew confronted the marshal the next morning at the courthouse, a building already leaning as if the law itself were tired. The marshal sat behind a desk scarred by knives and ink. He looked up when Drew entered. "Doctor," he said, drawing the word out. "You've been busy." "I have," Drew answered, "and I brought evidence." He set the letter on the desk. The marshal's face changed slightly, like recognition had tugged a hidden string. "Where did you get that?" I got it from my wife, Drew replied, and I know what it means. The marshal's eyes flicked toward the window, then back. You're crossing lines, he warned. Drew's hands tightened. I'm walking across them. Your lies won't pass into my practice. I won't allow it. The marshal leaned back. If you're accusing your own family of wrongdoing, I'm not accusing, Drew interrupted. I'm correcting. I'll testify. I'll speak to anyone who will listen, but you will not take her while you hide behind paperwork. The marshal stared at him, calculating. Drew saw the moment the marshal realized this wasn't just a doctor with a guilty heart. It was a doctor with a plan. You want to fight, the marshal said. I want to keep my wife alive, Drew corrected. The marshal's mouth tightened. Then you'll learn this town doesn't care about your private morality. Drew met his gaze. They'll care when you stop being able to hide your cruelty behind a stamp. Behind him, Etta stepped forward and placed the beadwork strip on the desk. And they'll care when people understand what they're trying to steal, she added. The marshal's eyes flashed. He didn't have a ready answer. His authority depended on silence and confusion. The twist, Drew felt it now, was that Arizel wasn't only fleeing danger. She was dragging history into the light, and that history named his family as a tool that made the taking possible. The marshal swallowed. This will be investigated, he said carefully. Good, Drew replied, because I'm tired of medicine being the only mercy this place allows. The weeks that followed were slow and bitter. No one in Briar Flats became suddenly noble. People still stared, still whispered, still tried to test Arizel with cruel jokes and sudden accidents. But the marshal now moved cautiously, aware that the town could turn on him if his lies were exposed. Drew's practice began to receive visitors, sicker people from outside towns, people who heard there was a doctor who didn't ask for respectability before he offered help. Etta became crucial in ways she hadn't expected. She kept the boarding room running, built a network of women who shared supplies, and protected Arizel when Drew had to step away. In quiet moments, Arizel's demeanor shifted. She began to lean into life instead of merely surviving it. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the hills, Drew found Arizel on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. Her bruises were nearly gone. Her eyes looked softer, but the softening was not surrender. It was safety. Drew sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. You're thinking too loud, she said. I think about the letter, he admitted, and about my father. I hate that his choices, even if he's gone, keep reaching. Arizel turned toward him. Your father did what men like him did, she said. He believed he could trade away harm and keep the peace. Drew swallowed. Was he wrong? Arizel's eyes held his. He was careless with lives, she replied. But you aren't him. Drew's throat tightened. Then what am I? Arizel reached for his hand, slowly, as if to ensure he wouldn't pull away. Her fingers were warm now, calloused from work, careful with his skin. You're a man who stays, she said, and that's rare. Drew looked down at their hands. He felt something in his chest loosen like a knot unraveling. I didn't know love could feel like duty, he said. Arizel's mouth quirked. Love isn't duty, she corrected. Duty is what you do when you don't want to be cruel. Love is what you do when you can't bear to be indifferent. Drew let out a breath that sounded like a laugh but wasn't. That makes you terrifying, he said. Arizel's eyes flashed. Good, she replied. I don't want gentle, I want true. The last external conflict arrived like weather, sudden, unavoidable, and full of moral danger. A traveling company of men came to Briar Flats with the intention of collecting debts. Not debts in money, but debts in women and land. They carried papers from elsewhere, papers that called themselves legal. When Drew saw them, he felt dread return. He also felt anger sharpen. Arizel stood behind him in his doorway, her posture straight. Etta held the lantern, her face pale but resolute. The leader of the company spoke as if he were doing kindness. We're here to settle matters, he announced. Your wife is claimed. Your marriage is convenient but void. We'll take her to be placed where she belongs." Arazel's eyes did not waver. "I belong where my life is safe," she said. The man laughed. "Safety is wherever authority points." Drew realized then what the twist truly was. The danger hadn't been only local greed. It was a system that used law and paper to turn native women into movable pieces. His family seal had been one thread, the marshal's negligence another, and the town's hunger a third. If these men took Arazel, they would justify it using whatever story made them feel clean. Drew could not stop them with kindness. He could stop them with evidence, with people, with the kind of courage that looked ugly from the outside. Drew stepped forward. "If you take her," he said, "you'll answer to every patient you'll never heal again. You'll answer to every woman in this town you think is afraid." The leader sneered. "You're bluffing." Etta lifted her chin. "No," she said. "He's telling the truth." The leader looked at her with contempt, but she kept her stance steady. Arazel moved then, not like a victim, not like a woman pleading, but like a person executing a plan. She reached into her buckskin wrap and produced the beadwork strip again, holding it high enough for the lantern light to catch the patterns. "I'm not a possession," she said, "and this isn't only my lineage, it's my proof." The leader's gaze flicked to it. For a moment, his confidence faltered. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it wasn't meaningless. Drew seized the moment and pulled out the letter with his family seal. "This seal helped build the lie you're trying to sell," Drew said. "If you take her without verifying, you'll be the next headline. You'll be the next inquiry, and you'll be the next man to learn what happens when paper meets witnesses." People began to gather outside, drawn by voices and fear. Briar Flats wasn't noble, but it was full of people who were tired of being afraid. Under the lantern glow, Drew saw faces that looked hardened, yes, but also capable of change. A storekeeper's widow clutching her shawl, a blacksmith's apprentice with bruised knuckles from working too long, a mother with her baby asleep and her eyes wide. The leader's men shifted their weight. A threat without an audience was always stronger. A threat with witnesses could become punishment. The leader turned his head slightly, whispering to his men. Then, to Drew's shock, he made the choice to back away. "We'll come back," he said, "when the records are corrected." Drew didn't believe records corrected meant justice. He believed it meant, "We'll look for a better lie." But the immediate danger passed. That night, Arazel collapsed into Drew's arms as if her body had been holding itself upright by will alone. Her head rested against his coat, and she breathed like someone who had been underwater. Drew wrapped his arms around her carefully. He expected anger to return, expected fear to keep biting. Instead, tenderness settled in. Etta watched from the doorway, silent. Drew saw in her face both relief and grief. Relief that Arazel remained safe, grief because it reminded Etta of how close she'd come to living with a smaller truth. Arazel pulled back just enough to look at Drew. "You fought," she whispered. "You were going to be taken," Drew replied. "That's not a doctor's duty, that's a human one." Arazel's eyes shimmered. "You didn't just keep me alive," she said. "You kept me from becoming a story someone else wrote." Drew pressed his forehead to hers. "Then tell me your story," he begged. Arazel closed her eyes. In the firelight, her lashes looked like shadows. "My story is not easy," she said. "It has raids and hunger. It has running. It has the parts of us that get eaten by men who think they can swallow history." "I don't need it to be easy," Drew answered. "I need it to be yours." Arazel opened her eyes and smiled faintly. It wasn't a sweet smile, it was a brave one. "I will," she promised. The days turned into seasons, and seasons in Briar Flats weren't gentle. Winter came, then broke, then returned with a different temperament each time. The town's dying pace never fully stopped, but Drew's practice grew steadier. Patients arrived because someone had told them that a doctor would treat them without asking what color their skin was or what kind of family name they carried. Etta's network of women expanded, and their small acts of defiance became a kind of shelter. They hid medicine in flour sacks. They kept watch when men drank too much. They fed travelers when the world tried to starve them. Arazel rebuilt her life slowly, with knowledge that survival was not only physical, it was moral too. Sometimes she still woke at night with her body tense, as if expecting footsteps. When that happened, Drew didn't ask her why. He simply stayed beside her and kept his presence steady. On one spring morning, after the creek ran clear again and the snow had finally surrendered to green, Arazel stepped outside with Drew and Etta. The sky was so blue it looked unreal, like paint spilled by a careless hand. The air smelled of damp earth and new growth. Arazel looked toward the distant ridge, where the land rose and fell like breathing. "My people will come," she said. Drew's heart tightened. "When?" "Soon," she replied, "but not all of them. Some will stay away because they fear what men do to witnesses." Drew looked at her. "And you?" Arazel glanced back at him, eyes bright with a fierce kind of hope. "I want to stay too," she said. Drew's breath caught. "In Briar Flats?" "In this place," she corrected gently. "With you. Not as a bargain, as a choice." Etta's eyes widened. She stepped closer, as if afraid hope might break if she touched it too quickly. "You'll be leaving the town?" Etta asked. Arazel shook her head. "Not leaving," she said. "Expanding. There's a difference." Drew understood then what the real romantic resolution would be. This wasn't only about a man saving a wounded woman. It was about a woman forcing a man to confront the moral weight of his world and making him change. Drew took Arazel's hand and kissed her knuckles, careful and reverent. "I'm sorry for my family's seal," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for the hands that signed promises as if they were harmless." Arazel's gaze softened. "Apology doesn't undo," she said, "but it can be a beginning." Drew nodded. "Then let it be a beginning," he said. Arazel squeezed his fingers. "It already is," she replied. Later, when the sun warmed the boardwalk and the town's dust settled into familiar patterns, Drew made a new list of supplies, not with rationing in mind, but with plans for the future. He wrote names of herbs to gather. He wrote reminders about keeping bandages clean. Etta helped him hang curtains that weren't patched, and Arazel, Apache Woman, wife, survivor, began teaching the younger women how to stitch beadwork again, not as a relic, but as living language. When the first of Arazel's people arrived, their presence did not end the tenderness. It widened it. They came carefully, not trusting everything at once. Arazel greeted them with a voice that held both grief and resolve. Drew watched from a respectful distance. Then Arazel turned back to him and walked over, joining him as if he belonged in the space her life made. In the end, the twist was never that love appeared in the middle of hardship. The twist was that Drew's rescue demanded something of him deeper than protection. It demanded truth. It demanded repair. It demanded that he stop being a bystander to the harm written into paper. Arazel didn't become his redemption, she became his partner. And in a dying town that refused to die gracefully, their love took root anyway, dust-worn, morally complicated, and stubbornly real, until winter's threats were no longer the loudest story in their lives.